Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel is simply called Discerning What is True. We're going to talk about psychology and Kabbalah tonight. And the chapter we're reading is chapter 45, Synthesis. So we've been going through this particular book for the last 2 weeks, I guess, maybe a little longer than that. The day is the 23rd day again of November 2025. Thank you for being here. Synthesis, chapter 45. Carl Jung, like many other psychologists, observed a polar principle at work throughout the psyche. This manifested in reciprocations such as the animus and anima, and its oppositions like the resistance of ego to the mortido impulse. Pairs also operate within larger and more complex systems. For example, the psychological functions of thinking, feeling, sense, and intuition work in various pair combinations of introversion and extroversion around the yesod, while the active consciousness of the ego is polarized with the passive unconscious, which becomes the active partner during sleep. The side pillars are the most easily identified pair as they take up the masculine force and the feminine force in individuals. Here it is interesting to note that the role of the pillars is sometimes reversed in a quarrel between a man and a woman when a tiff escalates. Into a competition between the man's anima and the woman's animus. Sorry about that, having a little issue here. This kind of polarization occurs within the psyche when different impulses, desires, and ideas contradict each other, and they form a lock between two aspects of the tree that cannot find a resolution. Such a situation is often rooted in a log jam in the psychological flow or in the loss of control. These can range from a afflicted Jerah Hezek that is obsessed about injustice, as is found in many protesters, to the faulty, or to what I call a faulty Had and Nezah that seek a completely hedonistic expression to all of their impulses. Fortunately, there are processes that eventually overcome these problems in most people as they mature psychologically. Carl Jung called this, quote, progression, end quote. The term was used to describe how the psyche was continually in a state of change, although it might have reached its optimum stage of development, so that even a saint still has to process what life presented and to adapt to continually changing conditions, that is. This meant, for example, that there was an endless process of adjustment which would call for different functions. For instance, at one point, the functions of action might predominate, pushing its counterpart of intuition into the background. At other times, when action could not cope, then intuition would come out of its unconscious role to compensate for what the sense triad could not do. An example of this is the mountaineer in a panic. All of his tools are quite useless in the state of mind until suddenly his intuition, calling upon all the experience stored in the unconscious, reminds him of a spiritual discipline that will calm him down. This is the most important technique he needs to get out of his difficulty. The above kind of crisis, when a person finds him or herself without any procedure to deal with a new situation, occurs when all familiar patterns are redundant, leaving the individual puzzled and sometimes in a quite unstable position. Here is where the process of synthesis starts, obviously, to operate. Such events occur at the onset of puberty, when there is a draining of energy from a juvenile set of ideas or emotions into adolescent systems of interest. Out of this comes all the drama of conflict with parental authority and the making and breaking of relationships with peers of both sexes. Hopefully, a new person in body shape and mental outlook emerges to cope with the situation. This traumatic period is more than just a equilibrium of exchange. It is fundamentally reorientation in the use of time and an energy that dissolves a whole way of life as the maturing psyche takes on a new kind of balance. Some have gone through this crisis, I should say, but not synthesize it, their experience, which means that they often continue to regard their sexual partners as perennial substitutes or just people one plays with for amusement or excitement. Such individuals often suffer much as a result in that they cannot relate as adults. Fortunately, the principle of progression moves us on whether we like it or not, and life usually offers a solution in some fatal meaning with just the right person, although that rightness may not be apparent until later because they may be the hammer that breaks the shell. In complement to progression is regression. Here again, Carl Jung uses the term in a special way. Progression, for him, is the addition of energy to a psychological element so that it is nourished and maintained, while regression takes energy out of a given system or function, so debilizing it. Thus, an adolescent no longer reads comics or is interested in childish games as he or she becomes preoccupied with more interesting matters. All the subtle skills and grace of childhood disappear as the individual copes with a dramatically altering Yasada image. Unfamiliar thoughts, feelings, and actions, which are often initially expressed in crude and gouge modes, are experienced as regression takes one back to learning to handle one's body and mind anew. Young observed that many old problems disappear during such transitional periods. This seemed to be due to the loss of power and opposing element as a new order took up the energy. For example, belligerent tomboy girls have been known to turn into the most loving sweethearts. Moreover, he noted this not only applied to natural changes in the process of not maturation, I should say, but also in psychological situations which cannot be resolved by opposing interests. For instance, a woman who hated her job but was worried by the idea of being financially insecure might become ill and so get herself becomes ill and so get herself on pay sick leave. This is an unconscious solution that could give her time to look around for a new job, or take the man in a bad marriage. He may start fooling around with other women in order to be thrown out of the home, which would perhaps solve the problem. In both cases, a regressive response pushes the person to a crisis in which they are forced to break a situation they could not deal with consciously. A phase of regression is not at all uncommon just before a breakthrough into a new stage of development. However, it is often a heavy price to pay for development. Seen Kabbalistically, that is, the progression and regression are the oscillation of the tree in general or of a part in particular. Structures and energy patterns are built up to perform a certain task, and once this task is done, the configurations begins to dissolve. The interim phase is when the tree is in momentary equilibrium. This is perceived as a certain psychological quiescence in which the person seems calm or even indifference for a brief time, or as a state of apparent imbalance when a panic or profound sense of insecurity sets in. This continues until the sephirah and triads start to work again, and the person is once more involved in the action. For example, the man with excessive giraffe is often severely censored by others. This may reach a point when he is no longer sure what discrimination or judgment is. However, out of this reaction may come a greater tolerance generated by the swing from a momentary pause at the self on the center column towards the compassion of Hesed. This leads us on to the notion that the resolution of opposites is more than mere exhaustion in a war of attrition or just a shift of emphasis in another system. It is the intervention of what is called by some spiritual traditions the, quote, third force or grace, end quote. In all esoteric systems, there is, as said, always the principle of the Trinity. In the Veda teachings, they are called rajas, tamas, and sattva, sattva. These correspond to the active, passive, and consciousness principles of the Goetia system, which in turn relate to the yang, yin, and unseen reconciliation of Tao of Chinese mysticism. In Kabbalah, the three are sometimes called Zohat, or hidden splendors that generate the three columns of the tree of life. The interaction of these three factors was the subject of much metaphysical study. The various combinations can be multiplied and subdivided into greater and greater complexity as they work their way down through all four worlds. For our purpose is sufficient to recognize that any new event only occurs when the three principles come together. When just two are involved, nothing new happens since they merely oppose or accommodate each other. But when the third element is introduced, then the focus shifts and sometimes quite original, occurs. The most obvious example is in intimate relationships. Two people can meet but not necessarily relate. However, if there is a third force, such as a common interest, then a quite new situation can arise. It is not enough just to bring a man and a woman together. There has to be his third force to make them fall in love. It may be sex, temperament, or karma. It can be anything that unites the male and female, and in the parentheses says, or the active and passive, that is in parentheses, in them, even though they may reverse or periodically exchange the positive and negative roles. These are seen in Kabbalah as functions, the third or central factor being consciousness, which can act as a catalyst even at a hidden level. The same principle occurs within the psyche. At one point, or I should say at one period, in a reciprocal relationship between a pair of elements may be necessary to hold the stability of, say, the ego. But there will come a time when this situation holds back an important judgment, such as a change in attitudes that could save a job or marriage. Then the third force, whatever it may be, prompts the person to act or think in another way. For instance, a man could suddenly become remarkably interested in his job if he is threatened by the sack, S-A-C-K, and the discovery of a mistress has made many wives revalue neglected husbands. This third factor is often unnoticed because it is either an unconscious element or so remote that it remains obscure, but nevertheless potent. An example of this was the startling dream that made a woman migrate. So too was the presence of unemployment, which simulate a man to lead to stagnation of his hometown. Sometimes the intervention is direct, as in the case of the woman who could not make up her mind. One day she suddenly decided to marry when she realized that she was only happy with the suitor she had constantly rejected. The self has shown her this in a moment of realization, which had galvanized the ego and loosened the opposite lock of the side columns that had been jammed in a conflict. Progression, regression, and then synthesis is a continuous process within the psyche. It goes on day after day at every level. At any given time, something is dissolving and something is resolving. If this did not occur, we would learn nothing and would not grow. Madness is a state in which too many functions and reciprocations have become knotted in the tree. In this situation, there is no movement, except to repeat a series of short circuits that sometimes blow out any possibility of change. When this happens, the psyche becomes a collection of split-off elements that cannot respond to the unifying principle embodied in the temporal. In the healthy psyche, the checks and balances are flexible but firm so as to be able to accommodate the various psychological mechanisms and aid the process of inner development. The fallow periods we all experience from time to time are the psychic way of making us pause while we synthesize the past and prepare for the future. Carl Jung advised people to take time off for this very purpose and so allow whatever needed to alter the center of gravity to be given the space to do so. In Kabbalah, the daily cycle of remembering who one is, where one is, and who else is present is designed to facilitate such changes as one walks the way of the Lord. This path, however, is not easy because one is beset not only by the squeaks and grinding of inner processes, such as described, but by the gods and demons that inhabit the Yasara world of the psyche. This is a realm few psychologists will admit as this, outside the imagination, but all esoteric traditions acknowledge the possibility of intrusion and possession and take it into account. Here's where Freud drew his line, or his limit, I should say, in his rejection of the occult. So that is the end of the chapter 45 today. As I proceed to share this with you today, thank you for being here. Again, this is chapter 45, synthesis. So synthesis is that you have one extreme and another extreme, and then what happens is if you come to the realization you need to come together, so to speak. So it's no longer alienated from one side to the other side, you see. And there has to be compromise, you see, in some ways to allow this on both sides. And that's what it means simply is the two pillars here, one representing one particular issue and another such and such. And eventually it works out in some way in the timing, possibly with what we call astrological charts that eventually the planets have effects upon us. I don't know if people know that. I'm pretty sure most people do know that. They can be for the positive or it could be for the negative, so to speak. And so what happens simply is like sharing here that the woman was putting up with someone she didn't really care for, she thought. And then what happened was simply she went with someone else and realized, wow, it's not better on this side either. So she went right back to where she was. In other words, okay, I need to compromise and realize simply this is not working out. So in other words, she had the grass was greener in her. She didn't see that. She didn't see that perspective. It could be both ways. It could be the man saying the same thing, realizing simply is that they were looking for a grass that would be greener on one side, and it turns out simply it's not. It's their own inabilities to see the value of the other person. The strengths of that person, but also the weaknesses of that person. And in order that takes place what we call congruency, or it comes together. And that's part of the way relationships work, you know, and people change. Some people don't change, you see. And so when somebody is changing and moving in a different direction and the other person's not, they're stagnant, they're happy with what it is, person becomes very frustrated because simply is that they no longer know this person. That person's moving in a different direction. The other one's simply maybe content to say where it's at. It's been that way since, you know, they've been married, so to speak. But what's happening here simply is that that's a possibility, a breakup. But it also may be a way of stimulating the person who is not willing to move forward somewhat, so that it can allow again the closeness and the bond. Anyway, thank you for being with us again. This is True Psychology and Kabbalah. The chapter is 45, the synthesis. There's probably a few more chapters left of this particular book. I'm assuming probably another 8 or 10 more chapters, but they're not really long chapters, so to speak. And thank you for being here. And hopefully you'll have a good evening and take care. All right. Good night.